Sí, gracias. Hola a todos, bienvenidos al seminario de educación continua.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seminar of continuous education on flood management in urban settings. We are going to wait a few minutes for people to join, and then we will start. But first, I wanted to let you know that we are going to have simultaneous interpretation to English and Spanish. So if you could please go ahead and select the interpretation, your preferred interpretation channel. You can find the globe icon in the lower part of your Zoom screens and select your preferred language. We are going to start. First, we want to ask you some short questions just to know exactly who is here in the seminar. So I'm going to share with you a few questions. And Hirun, if you could share on the chat box the link of the Mentimeter so that participants can answer. We basically want to know where you are located so that we know where participants are joining us from. And you should be able to see the link on the chat box right now for you to answer the question. And you're able to see the answers we're getting on screen, right? You should all be able to see the answers in real time. We see that there's a lot of people joining from the Americas, and so that's great because today's topic is mainly about projects that are being implemented in Mexico, but we also have participants from Europe and Africa and a few from Asia as well. So may you all be welcome and thank you for joining from all these different locations. I'm going to move on to the second question while we wait for more people to join. We would like to know, which sector are you in? We work on environmental management and disasters. So we know that there's people from different sectors that are interested in these topics. And right now I see that there's people joining us from climate change adaptation. Most of the people for now seem to come from that sector, but also people who have more experience in environmental management and conservation. So it's great that we have a very wide diversity of sectors from the participants. You can continue answering these questions while more people join us. We're going to stop sharing the questions and we're going to start. Before giving the floor to our guest, Sergio from CityAdapt, this is simply an introduction or a presentation of our team and to the continuing education seminar series. And I'm going to give the floor right now to our senior director, Anita Van Breda, so that she may comment a little bit about our team. And before that, I would just like to remind you to please connect to the interpretation channel. This is the way you do it. Select the globe icon in the lower portion of your Zoom screens. Anita, we're all yours.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to see everyone joining us today for this continuing education session. For those of you who are not familiar with our program, Environment and Disaster Management, we're based in the WWF office in the United States, but we work with our colleagues all around the world. This program is about 20 years old now. We have worked on many different extreme events and disasters over the years in many different countries, as you can see on the screen. And the goal of our program is a simple one. It's to reduce risk and vulnerability for both people and nature by including nature in disaster management. And we work to support social and ecological resilience where disaster management, environmental management, and development come together. All of that work also, of course, needs to be adaptive to a changing climate and also work together to address the climate crisis with climate mitigation, as well as the biodiversity loss crisis. So that is our program very briefly. Next slide, please. Just to say that our work is organized in 3 primary thematic areas: our green recovery and reconstruction work, which looks at multiple different sectors in disaster management. Our second program is about flood management, using nature to manage floods, and that's what our topic of discussion is today. And then our third program focuses primarily on infrastructure, on building reconstruction, as well as building materials. So that's our program. In summary, we will share more information at the end if you would like to connect with us and learn more about these work in detail. But with that brief overview, I will turn it back over to my colleague, Luz, to introduce our guest speaker. And thank you again for joining us today.
Gracias, Anita.
Thank you, Anita. And yeah, well, I just would like to tell you briefly about this regular seminar series on continuing education. We try to have these every 2 months, and these are spaces to continue learning about these topics related to disaster management, environment and disaster management. And so I would just like to see if you are also interested, to encourage you to contact us if you want to participate as a moderator, or if you know of any colleagues that could present or give us presentations in the seminar series, please write us, and also send us the topics of interest that you would like to hear about in the seminar series. In this seminar, we're going to have the Q&A section at the end, but you can feel free to share your questions throughout the presentation on the Q&A box on the Zoom. And to learn more about our future seminar series, you can join our newsletter in our webpage. Well, I would like to introduce Sergio Angon, and we are very grateful that he is sharing some of his time to talk about the projects that they have implemented with the UNEP program in Xalapa, Mexico. Sergio is a civil engineer with more than 18 years of experience in the conservation of natural resources and nature-based solutions for cities. He also participated in the international visitor leadership of the Department of State of the United States on sustainable cities, and he is currently working with CityAdapt on the projects of Xalapa, Mexico, and other cities of Latin America. So welcome, Sergio. And before you start your presentation, I simply wanted to mention how we came in contact with you and to learn about the work that you are doing with CityAdapt. As Anita mentioned before, we have the brief guide for urban flood management. You can also find urban issues, content, and the management in cities. You can download this if you don't know this. It's on the website. It's free access or open access, and we also have a version in Spanish. Here you can see some of the resources we have in this green guide. And in the green guide, we also have trainings that we normally deliver, and we had the opportunity of doing the collaboration with CityAdapt and Sergio, with Sergio in December of last year, and we had participants of different levels of the government, from state and municipal government from Xalapa, and we were able to share the resources of the green guide for floods. And these are some pictures so that you can see the types of trainings we had. We had the opportunity of learning about some of the projects that CityAdapt has implemented, and along with Sergio, on flood management in the city. We are very happy to hear more about this and to share the information and the experience from Sergio. So Sergio, you have the floor, and again, welcome to all of you. Thank you, Sergio. Thank you very much, Anita, Luz, and the entire team that makes this possible for me to present today. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my presentation. Please let me know if it's already in presentation mode. Yes, it looks good, Sergio. Yeah, I'm gonna turn off my camera just to improve my bandwidth because, my internet is not that great. I want to take the opportunity to thank WWF and the Environment and Disaster Management team that have invited me today to share with you on nature-based flood management solutions in urban environments, lessons learned from CityAdapt Xalapa, Mexico. And well, I would like to tell you that in this occasion, we are going to cover development of the climate change vulnerability analysis in the city of Xalapa. And just to give you a background, the CityAdapt project was developed since 2018 up to the year 2023 in the cities of Kingston, Jamaica, San Salvador, and El Salvador. And the only city in Mexico was the city of Xalapa. The city of Xalapa is a medium city of about 500,000 citizens, with an average rainfall of 1,500 millimeters per year and an average temperature of 18 degrees Celsius. Well, it used to have that weather, he says, but honestly, we are going through our third heat wave this year, and we have broken records of 38.5 degrees Celsius. And that speaks to the variability that the climate has had, especially in the last 10 years. And that's how long I have been knowing this city. Xalapa is facing hazards related to climate, such as floods and landslides, and it's highly vulnerable to water supply for human consumption. Because even though it rains so much in the city, we bring the water, 60% of it comes from a neighboring state called Veracruz, and 38% comes from another water basin from a neighboring city, but it's also not located within Xalapa. So there is a governance issue aside from the sustainable use of the natural resources that supply the water of the city. And in Xalapa, we continue having, like many other cities in the world, this paradox that you could be in the middle of a flood, and at the same time, you want to take a shower or wash your hands, and you open up the tap and there is no water. So that is the issue that many cities in our country and in Latin America are facing. I want to comment that the CityAdapt project in its first stage ended at the end of 2023. And right now we're working on the second stage, which is CityAdapt 2.0, to do this type of interventions in 7 cities of Mexico. And also would like to tell you that CityAdapt was a pioneer project on nature-based adaptation in cities. We have a sister program in Asia, in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. It's still under development. And also along with other projects in Latin America and the Caribbean, like Nature for Cities, that has 13 cities in the region, because it's starting to try to help cities to adapt in a better way to the negative effects of climate change. Before going into this topic about the methodology for a vulnerability analysis on climate change, I would like to say that vulnerability is based on the hazard, exposure, and sensitivity. And what balances the equation of vulnerability is the adaptive capacity. For this study, given that the project had an adaptation of, it was considered adaptive capacity was the absence or presence of ecosystems that first could provide ecosystem systems like water or carbon capture, etc., but that also at the same time that they would be able to buffer or offset the negative effects of climate change. So once we have that, the first stage of a vulnerability study of this type is to identify the hazards related to the climate or climate-related hazards, current and also under climate change scenarios. As a second stage, it is about finding out the number of people and production systems and also ecosystems that might be exposed to these hazards related to climate. As a third step, a sensitivity analysis was performed, which is those people that because of their living conditions are more fragile before in the face of these hazards. And lastly, the ecosystem services were evaluated at the level of water basin and urban settings with the goal to determine those ecosystems that were absent or present and which could help buffer or offset the impact of the hazards related to climate. So as a summary, I'm going to only present the development of the model of flooding hazard. And for that, we considered some factors like flatlands, like rainfall, like hydrography and the water valleys and the potential of flooding of the soil. And with these results, we were able to have the potential hazard flooding natural map. And as you can see in the upper part, which is the part that is that has the highest potential in red and orange, it actually matches or coincides with the area that is growing the most in our city. Xalapa is a medium city that has grown about 7 times its urban footprint. In other words, the homes, the houses, basically have been growing towards the northern part, literally devastating ecosystems. And its population has only doubled. This says that this is a city that is not density. There is no vertical development. There's a lot of development outward because already all the people that were living or that are coming to live in the city decide to live as close to nature as possible. And so they have been invading highly valuable ecological areas. And the ecosystem that characterizes this city is the mountain forest or the cloud forest. And it is so important that in just a portion of the national forest coverage, it can have 12% of the biodiversity of our country, aside from providing multiple ecosystem services for the city, such as the regulation of the microclimates, carbon capture or carbon sequestration. And we could say that the most tangible ecosystem service that allowed the CityAdapt project to put everybody and make them come to an agreement was water. The water for human consumption is a fundamental part of what this project was able to achieve by putting everybody in agreement on the urgency of doing something, of taking action to face that climate variability and that lack of availability of water for human consumption. Here we have an example that when we ended or finalized the analysis of potential hazard of flooding, there was a flood or a storm in the Gulf of Mexico, and the result was that all the places that the model of flooding had identified were actually flooded or did actually flood, and also places that didn't have a natural potential of flooding were also flooded, like the pictures we have on the right-hand side. These communication roads, they didn't have a natural potential for flooding. But there, it is important to mention that when you do a vulnerability analysis for decision-making locally, the scale factor is very important. In the city of Xalapa, it was necessary to develop this in a scale of 1 to 20,000. And that truly allows us to make decisions at the local level. So therefore, we came together with the municipality, and together we started to analyze why did these places that didn't have a natural potential for flooding, why were they being flooded? And we saw that this is for a very poor management of solid waste. People continue to be very responsible and irresponsible. We put our waste on the streets, on the public roads, and that bad management of waste gives this result. Some places become flooded even though they are not potentially or naturally floodable. With regards to the population exposure, we did this model and we found that it coincides with this highest growing area that I just mentioned. And here we can find how many people in streets, in neighborhoods, in squares are exposed to a hazard or 2 or more hazards related to climate, which made up this analysis. And this is very important when we talk about civil protection and disaster management, because it makes a lot of sense to understand where the most exposed population is. The most exposed production systems. And in the case of cities, people are the most important thing. So when we talk about civil protection, it would be ideal that all cities would have this type of analysis that would allow them, for example, to start being more proactive instead of always reacting after the events have occurred. So, well, this analysis has been very useful, for example, to locate the necessary shelters when we already know that an extreme rainfall event is happening. And we know that it makes a lot of sense to put these shelters for the people that are vulnerable or and as close as possible to where more people that are exposed could be, instead of just randomly locating them in the city and after the disasters happen to start reacting and moving our response teams. With regard to the socioeconomic sensitivity, this is the condition that puts people or population groups in a situation of relative weakness when facing hazards. Due to the differentiated access to opportunities and resources, some of the characteristics of these people with the greater sensitivity are that they live in a house without, for example, sewage or water or electric energy. They do not have a car to move in case of an emergency. They do not have access to health services, or they have a physical disability. And this photo that you see on screen talks about that spatial segregation between the people that have the least economic possibilities versus those that have more economic opportunities. People, unfortunately, with the fewer economic possibilities, settle in places that are not ideal for urban development, where it's very unlikely that the municipality can provide electrical energy and water, etc. And just with a long time that passes, is it that they are able to have those services. And plus, these people normally are in a vulnerability situation by settling in these river places or places that are very difficult, which make it hard to get the supply of municipal utility services, but also the response when facing natural disasters or those that are related to climate. With regard to the adaptive capacity, I would like to highlight the importance of trees in the temperature. So importance of tree coverage of the city's temperature. So we have satellite photos with which we have analyzed. And in January of 2019, when we started with this analysis, and we saw that the superficial temperature of the city of Xalapa was, there was a difference of 7 degrees. When you see number 15, that's a protected natural area in the middle of the city, and number 22 is that's a city where everything is, it has very little tree coverage. So you can see a variation, 15 and 22, that's the difference in temperature at the same time. And there you can realize the issue or the problem, which is not having the green infrastructure, the natural capital that is necessary to improve the thermal comfort of people. And also trees, in the case of floods, provide places for water drainage, and they can avoid also and also help people to better overcome those dangers of flooding. With regards to the ecosystem services, I'm only going to say here that we have used the natural capital project of Stanford through the Invest tool. And here, as you can see the gray area here in the middle of the map is the impermeable area of the city, and everything that you can see in orange or yellow corresponds to the presence of ecosystems that allow the provision of water or to filter rainwater and to maintain the microclimate of the city. With regards to the integrated climate change vulnerability, we find that the most vulnerable areas when facing climate change correspond to the northern areas of our city and the western part that is neighboring another city. And that's basically what the vulnerability analysis was about, of being able to respond to the question to what are we vulnerable to, and then to take actions, informed actions, in order to propose solutions. And that's why, starting now, we will be able to address the climate change scenarios. We had already addressed what the current vulnerability is. However, in climate change scenarios for this city, with a baseline of 2014 and forecasted up to the year 2039 with an RCP of 4.5, we did a downscaling to make visible how these scenarios would look at the city level. And we found that in the future, we could be able to experiment reductions or decreases in rainfall up to 250 millimeters in the urban landscape. However, rainfall is going to increase, and where we take the water from, which is the highest water basin, there could be rainfalls of over plus than 550 millimeters accumulated per year. So in climate change, not everything is bad news, he says. There's also opportunities if we have information such as this one, and decisions can be made with regards to planning for the sustainable development of cities. In terms of temperature, it is possible to experiment increases of temperature of up to plus 2.5 degrees Celsius. And it seems little, 2.5 degrees Celsius, but if I would tell you that globally, only 1.07 degrees Celsius has increased globally, and we are experimenting more and more heat waves that exceed the medium or the mean averages of heat in the cities, then 2.5 degrees Celsius, believe me, it is a lot. I remind you that the climate change scenarios can facilitate decision-making on the measures that allow us to adapt to the negative effects of climate change. Now, we are going to see an example of the solutions that we implement for flood management in the city of Xalapa. The problem was that there was an area, there was a high specialty hospital that had a high potential of flooding, a natural high potential of flooding, as you can see from this image taken from Google Earth. And I want to tell you that also this vulnerability analysis, all the layers were made available so that everybody could be able to download them and use them. And these could be able to work in any platform like Google Earth, so free or open access data that allow us to see the data. So having mentioned this announcement, I will continue with the example. Well, these people that continuously were visiting this medical specialty hospital, they were not happy because during rainfall, there was a serious accumulation of water, and the cars that moved by and passing with very high speed, they were always splashing the water on them. The situation began with a solution thought only in water management, but because there were scenarios of the pandemic or the COVID-19 scenarios, we had to do a deeper analysis of the solution that we wanted to implement. And that is why we did an analysis on social perception or social perspective on the public space and vegetation. And 79% of the people that were surveyed, they said that vegetation is beneficial and that it allows them to keep a very good, temperature comfort. And with the possibilities of using the public space, you can here notice how people were using the public spaces during the pandemic. Since the hospital was closed down and almost everything was shut down because of the pandemic, then people had to wait for their family members who were inpatients of the hospital, and they would use the public space, as you can see in the pictures. Some of the needs that were collected with them is that more vegetation was needed, and also garbage bins, seats and tables, water drinking fountains and bathrooms. So we found a lot of health systems lacks with the social perspective that made us see the need of having a waiting room. And that's why in the end, you will see what this nature-based solution came up with. We also did an environmental perspective analysis. We needed to make evident the economic amount of maintaining trees in this area, so that through an open access tool called iTree Canopy, I'm sorry, he says it was called iTree Echo, we did an analysis of all the trees that were in the area where we were going to put these gardens. And we found out that there were many trees that had water stress because there was a lot of concrete. They had very small spaces, and the few spaces that they had, because people were using those spaces as best as they could, they were highly dense by human traffic. So these trees had these characteristics, and they were providing these ecosystem services, for example, of eliminating the contamination or pollution reduction of 22 kilometers per year, which represented about $1,081 per year. They had a carbon storage of 18.13 tons, which represented an economic impact of $342, and they had the potential of continuing to sequestrate carbon at 1 ton per year, which represented about $20 per year. And they had a structural value of $166,000. So we're talking about 70 specimens that were around this hospital. And it is important to determine the value of ecosystem services to convince decision makers in matters of urban development to conserve ecosystems, to understand the value beyond the environment, but also the economic value of maintaining the natural capital of the cities. Now we go into the design. We had the need of infiltrating rainwater, and remember that this was a solution basically aimed at managing the amount of water that this space had. We did a water analysis that allowed us to understand where the water was coming from, what was the lowest point where the intervention had to happen. And we also did an analysis of water mechanics to find the strata of the soil, and we found about 28 liters per hour that could be infiltrated in this soil. And so to finish off the design, we decided to ask the municipality if there was underground infrastructure around these gardens, because we didn't want to impact that infrastructure in any way. And they told us that honestly, they did not remember what was below those gardens. So we had to do a georadar analysis, which is an indirect analysis through geophysics that is helpful to identify infrastructure like aqueducts or electrical wire that are underground. And in fact, we did find some electrical structures, fiber optics, but we also found a tube that was 32 meters of diameter that carries most of the water of the city. So imagine if we hadn't done this analysis, if we hadn't done or taken this caution, we could have been able to break that tube or that pipe. But thankfully, we went safe. And when we were building or developing the solution, we did an analysis in current precipitation or rainfall analyses, and we found that with this solution, it was possible to help infiltrate all the water that was reaching this area, except for the month of August, where we were going to have an excedent and overplus volume of 178 cubic meters. So this means that the nature-based solutions for managing floods, although they are designed in engineering terms and also through the perspective of infiltration, etc., they also need to be developed with the current climate conditions. And so what was going to happen with these 168 cubic meters that would not be able to infiltrate? They will basically go back to the road so that they continue their work or their journey downstream. In scenarios of climate change, as you might remember, the city could experiment a reduction of minus 250 cubic meters of rain accumulated. And that's why we did a simulation of how this nature-based solution was going to work in scenarios of future climate change scenarios. And we found that it was going to be even more useful because the surplus that was not going to be able to infiltrate through this solution, it was only 11 cubic meters in the month of July and 70 cubic meters in the month of September. I want to remind you that the rainfall season in this area is from June to October, and it's in August and September where there is the highest rainfall. And that's why a nature-based solution needs to be done, including climate change. Unfortunately, cities more and more so are facing the negative effects of climate change. Extreme temperatures, hydrometeorological events that are more recurrent and with greater intensity. Some of the benefits that we were able to identify is that aside from filtering the water in the soil, we improved the quality of the air, temperature went down, and it was possible to benefit biodiversity. Also, noise went down, and other ecosystem services were also provided. And for this, we used a vegetation palette, which was divided in 3 strata. One were climate regulators, which are pioneer trees, large trees that allow people to use the space in an adequate manner. And after, there was a second strata of vegetation with sensitive species that would help people to connect or reconnect with nature. And it is important to tell you that there is a video, and I'm going to share the link later, and you can find it on our YouTube channel, and you can find CityAdapt, and there you can find all the interventions that took place not only in this city, but also in all of those that were included in the project. And there you can see a little bit more on the methodology to do, these types of forests, which was the Miyawaki methodology, which is a very high density trees to compete within them and to offer very important ecosystem services, like you can see in the picture below. And now we're going to see another example of the solutions that were implemented. This natural protected area that you can see in this orange polygon in the map on the left corresponds to a natural protected area that is in the city. The city has surrounded this natural protected area, and also in this natural protected area, there was a very complicated issue with regards to security. Throughout time, in the last maybe 20 years, there were some unfortunate events of security in this area, or safety, and so that naturally protected area was abandoned. Some people sometimes would go there, but basically they considered it as a landfill. And so the development of the city, as it started moving to that natural area, they started throwing a lot of construction or building waste, and the natural resources that were regulating the floods there started to lose their functions and role. They stopped absorbing, it stopped absorbing water, it started having invasive species, and especially it became a pollution point. And many times some decision makers started to think of, making it impermeable and to make it like a housing project or something that would be more useful. However, thanks to the population that defended it or advocated for it, we joined them and we started to do activities where people could participate and ask them what it is that they expected from this place. And they said that they wanted for this wetland to be rescued, that it would get back the roles or functions that it had before. And a lot of the older people told us that when they were little, more than 40 years ago, they would go and play there, and they would go and swim, and they used to fish. There were a lot of amphibians and a lot of trees and vegetation that was a wetland. So that's what the problem looked like. There was a lack of social fabric, and there was a need of make that space more adequate so that it wouldn't contaminate in the future, and it wouldn't be a household, a living place. So we started to work on the solution, and we did many different analyses, like to look at the right vegetation that needed to be there. We verified the water network to facilitate the flow of water. In some places, we had to remove all the waste from the wetland. We had to improve the conditions of compacting, that means that we had to decompact the soil so that it could be able to absorb rainfall or water again. And also at the request of citizens, we had to do something with this small slope here because there was a football or a soccer field and kids had, it was risky. It was a hillside or a slope and it had trees so it could fall. So we together did an intervention, which is to do actions to ecologically conserve this wetland and for it to recover its functions, and also to put some trails to be able to allow the water to filter itself, and also for people to be able to walk, adequately and to enjoy the ecosystem services within this natural area. And we also did this wall to stabilize that. So as you can see in these pictures, in the picture of the upper left hand, there's people recovering and restoring this wetland. And as you can see, there's already some water visible there. And in the multiple use field where there was the slope which could slide, we did this bioengineering, bleacher, and the terraces are going to be incorporated and and so this is going to be more and more stable because the trees that were used or the vegetation that was used will help to compact these terraces and make this place or this intervention more stable. On the QR code that you see on the left, you can look at the summary video for you to check, and you will probably understand much better what I'm explaining. So in matters of appropriation or ownership, we were very clear that we needed to engage most of the population and neighbors that were there close to the protected area. And 60% of the work done in this project was women from the community. We also needed to take ownership of the place. It needed to be owned by the people first so that they could take care of it, and two, for this to become a space that they were able to use and for them to defend it, to make, instead of having, someone come and build houses and roads. It's important to have the right scale vulnerability study that allows to make visible the benefits of these spaces and the need to intervene with these nature-based solutions. It is necessary to have strategic partnerships, even with the media, that engages or involves the largest number of people. And in matters of sustainability, it is important to have local governments, subnational and national governments participate, and so also to give a voice and a vote to the most vulnerable. And also would like to tell you that this project had the creation of a funding mechanism to foster nature-based solutions in this city that consisted in the voluntary donation through water accounts of the city of donating 2% of the electrical bill for nature-based solutions. And well, I want to give you some great news, which is thanks to the impact that the solution has had, there was a process of scaling, and the subnational government is investing around $600,000 right now to continue the ecological restoration of the wetland. The CityAdapt project and for the Global Environmental Fund. And now the subnational government has invested something as an additional $600,000 to continue working with the construction waste in the area. And currently this space looks like that. Luz and her team had the opportunity visiting the space when they were here in Xalapa last year. And I want to tell you that right now we are much happier because the initiative is growing and becoming larger, and that's what nature-based solutions are about. To demonstrate the benefits and eco-benefits, even the economic benefits, to help convince or compel more decision makers, and that the nature-based solutions, such as in this case for flood management, can become preferred solutions when we talk of sustainable development. or urban development. And finally, and lastly, I would like to highlight some key aspects for decision makers. Vulnerability analysis facilitates decision making. It can provide tools for planning and for urban development planning. Some of the challenges of nature-based solutions are the paradigm of urban development. Even all the Latin American cities are thinking of urban development when we talk about paved roads and municipal public services such as water and electrical energies, and also internet, fiber optics. There is a challenge on nature-based solutions that consists of the lack of understanding of most people with respect to these types of solutions. There are challenges in its implementation because it's a little bit complicated to find the funding, as you well know, and especially sustainability. It is important that we move from these pilot interventions, such as the ones that I've shown you, to solutions that can be in regulation and the first options when we talk about sustainable, so that it can remain in time. And that also talks about, you know, the ownership of the city based on these solutions. With regards to the barriers for adoption, there is a lack of perception, and we continue to think that someone else is responsible to affect, you know, the negative effects. Not me, the government maybe, because I'm paying for my taxes. There is a lack of access to information, to current information that shows the benefits and co-benefits, and that especially that there is a lack of examples that take to the evaluation or lead to the evaluation of the impacts of climate change. It's very important to offer the largest amount of information, not only of the benefits and co-benefits environmentally and socially, but also the economic benefits of this type of interventions. The communication is a fundamental part of this process of adoption and flood management in urban settings. Decision makers, we need to be capable of segmenting the audience based on their interests, based on their age groups, with the intention of offering a common language that is clear and simple, that allows to transmit the benefits and co-benefits of these types of solutions. With respect to institutional capacity, it is more and more necessary to have officials that are informed and that know about the scenarios of climate change, and that maximize the impacts of the measures of nature-based solutions, such as this case for flood management. With regards to the opportunities, I would like to again thank WWF, Anita, Luz, and all the team for allowing me to have in this session to have some networking. I would like for cities to connect more ones with others, to share these types of experiences, and to encourage collaboration between cities more and more. There is a high need of sharing these types of experiences, and especially of generating strategic partnerships in every spoke, between governments, between people, between organizations, and why not also between international cooperation. From my side, this has been all, and I'm paying close attention if you have any questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sergio. Super important information and very nice projects that you're doing in Xalapa, and it's great to learn the methodology. So thank you very much for all the information from the presentation. We did get a few questions already. There are two that are related. Do you want to know more about the tools or the methods that were used to measure vulnerability of the communities? And there's another similar question, but not vulnerability, but actually the resilience of population. If you can comment more about those methodologies or tools, please let us know. Yeah, to determine the vulnerability of people, there was a sensitivity analysis, a socioeconomic sensitivity analysis, where many variables were taken into consideration, which were related to the people from the population census of 2020 of Mexico. And some factors were chosen, like women-led homes and access to information, access to health services, intersectional groups, and there was also an analysis, a sensitivity analysis with gender sensitive analyses, because it's very important to highlight the differentiated access to opportunities that men and women have, boys, girls, the elderly, and also minorities, and also LGBTQ, and also, you know, when we talk about all these cross-sectional groups. So based on that analysis, and also based on the evaluation of the integrated vulnerability to the exposure of hazards related to climate hazards or climate-related hazards, and to ecosystems and people, and also the analysis of socioeconomic sensitivity, it was possible to do the modeling of vulnerability, considering the positive part, which was the presence or absence of ecosystems that allowed us to have ecosystem services that would offset the negative effects of climate change. Could you please repeat question number 2, Luz? Yes, it was related. I don't know if you had also specific methodology to measure resilience, or was it basically so the resilience of population? It was through vulnerability. If we consider resilience, the concept is like the inverse of vulnerability. As we are more vulnerable, we are less resilient. And to assess vulnerability, we considered through a matrix where the largest vulnerability, there were the worst socioeconomic conditions and environmental conditions. And so resilience, that's how we measure it. So it's really clarifying when we truly speak with local governments. Thank you, Sergio. A question about the species of trees. I know that you mentioned that we're different strata of vegetation, but the question is basically what species, if you could please comment on that. Yeah, so, you know, urban settings and local communities, we use local species, so basically native species, not endemic, from the mountain, like something like trees called marangolas, and he's trying to think something else called indite, Mexican hayas, Mexican plantains, encinos, and some cone trees or pine trees. And we also did something related to assisted migration. It is very important that when we talk about revegetating an urban ecosystem in scenarios of climate change, if we could consider that there could be conditions, adverse conditions of climate, like the reduction of rains and an increase of temperature, it'll be strategic to start introducing gradually species of the neighboring area that can allow us to have adapted water, plants that are adapted to lower quantities of water and higher temperatures. So there was an analysis of the species and the tones or things that are surrounding the city. So these were the types of species that were selected in the vegetation palette for these areas. So we have a lot of questions. So just for you to know that if you do not get your question answered today, we will follow up after the webinar, but we still have a few minutes left. There is a question related to the data. I know that many times it's hard to get the data for the risk analysis or some methodologies. So did you have any problems to find the available data, Sergio? And if not, the person wants to know if that wasn't a challenge, then what was the largest challenge that you found? Yes, definitely. Especially in Latin American cities, it is a challenge to find all the data. In terms of the socioeconomic aspects, we had no issues because we had the population census where we have most of the data. However, there were other data locally in the census that the census didn't provide. So these we did through mechanisms of citizenship participation by doing surveys to a representative number of people in the city with the goal of determining the data or finding the data that we didn't have. So with regard to data of ecosystems and the use of soil and vegetation and connectivity, for example, the landscape connectivity analysis, we did it. Much of the data is generated by the project. And we used national authorized sources like the National Institute of Statistics and information that gives us some layers of use of soil and vegetation, climates, geology, etc. But all the information that we didn't have was generated by the project. And the important thing of this vulnerability analysis is that there's a methodology that can be replicated in other cities of Mexico, and we can lead forward with the data available in our countries to lead forward these types of analysis. One of the main challenges to do these interventions, believe me, it wasn't the vulnerability analysis and data. Climate data, as you might know, you do an analysis of the climate with 30-year or history data, and there's methodologies that you can use to verify that that data is reliable and correct, and with them you can do forecasts. But that wasn't the main challenge. The main challenge was to compel the local authorities for them to allow us to implement in the public space, to implement these interventions, and especially to make the people the most vulnerable ones to have a voice and a vote, that we may be able to hear their needs, to see their concerns of treating the points, and to do interventions and nature-based solutions that can truly put people and the ecosystems at the core of the discussion. So truly the access to information, convincing decision makers and local governments was the main challenge. And also funding, of course, right? Because that's always a complicated issue. Thank you, Sergio. Well, maybe one last question before closing. They wanted to know if you have identified any legal needs or gaps in the process. Well, I want to say that by having planning instruments that consider ecosystems, that's very new in Mexico. From this vulnerability analysis, it was able to advocate for the urban development of the city, to consider the adequate places based on vulnerability. So all the results of the project are right now in that planning instrument. There are some legal gaps, but basically not because sustainable development is not considered in matters of development in our country and Latin American cities, but also because precisely there is the what, but not the how. It's not well developed that nature-based solutions need to take place, and that nature-based approaches need to be taken into considered. And especially when you ask for the development banking in Mexico, there is no taxonomy that says that you can ask for resources to do nature-based solutions. Normally, the public works related to urban development with disaster risk management in Latin American cities are still based on gray infrastructure. Every time you need funding for public works, it's to do roads and drainage systems and buildings, etc. But there have been very important efforts in Mexico to have sustainable taxonomies, to do these action mechanisms and laws, because we are pioneers in many of these activities, but now we need that mortal leap to go back to these types of solutions as the preferred solutions when we talk about sustainable urban development. Thank you very much, Sergio. And yes, the questions that we have left, we are going to try to work on the answers along with Sergio. And thank you so much for your interest. I am going to add a link on the chat box because we wanted to know from you to learn what are the main challenges that you have faced in the management or implementation of nature-based solutions in urban settings. So if you want to answer this, we would love to have this information. And because we are very close to finalizing, then I'm going to give the floor to Anita so that she can close the seminar. And thank you all so much. Again, thank you for the information, Sergio. And here's the information to stay in touch with us in the future. Anita, we're all yours.
Thank you so much, Luz, and to Sergio. This was a fantastic presentation. I learned so much. And there's much more that we could continue to talk about. So I hope we can invite you to come back at some point. Just 4 things that I wanted to leave you all with, because Sergio, what you discussed, we address in our Flood Green Guide training, almost everything that you mentioned. But 4 things stood out to me. One is that, as you explained, not all floods are bad. Many floods are natural. So we have to take the good and manage and reduce the negative impacts of floods. But even in urban places like the places you described, there's always something we can do to make the situation better, and that nature has a lot to offer in that way. Third, that legal gaps and management gaps were mentioned. Even if we want to use nature-based approaches, are the legal abilities there in that place? Do the institutions have authority to make those types of decisions? That's still something that needs to be addressed in many places of the world. But Sergio, I think you really hit the nail on the head, so to speak, with your comment about engaging the people and the social systems. We find that the natural systems, the science of climate and water management is, as you said, almost the easy part. The really challenging part with nature-based solutions is bringing the people, all of the people, the community, the government, the decision makers into this process. And so I would love to learn more from you in future, how you address the community engagement part of this challenge. But we are out of time for today, so I will thank you all very much for your interest and for your participation. And please stay tuned in the future for more sessions such as this. Thank you, Luz.